Welcome to the ALS Treatment Pipeline webinar. We're very grateful to have our 4 panelists with us here today. Before we begin with that, I'm going to give a little bit of background very quickly about some of these items that we'll be discussing, just so that we can have a framing point for the discussion that you will hear. Okay. So on this slide, what you're going to see is the stages of clinical trials that happen as a treatment actually progresses through the pipeline for ALS. As you're going to see on the far left side, you're going to see that there are several lab studies that can happen. Pardon me, I'm sorry. One moment, please. Just going to mute myself for a second. Okay, sorry, I'm back, everyone. My apologies, quick technical difficulty there. Okay, here we go. We're a couple minutes late. So what you're going to see on this slide is at the far left, you have these potential therapies or treatments happen at the laboratory level where they're tested in animal models of ALS or in cells. And then once they're ready to move through to human testing, they move into what's called a phase 1 clinical trial, which is really to assess the dosing that would be safe for an individual to use, and also really looking at the safety and profile of those particular therapeutics. I've adjusted the numbers to reflect what you will typically see in an ALS clinical trial. Once they've passed that and a safe dose is found, it moves to a phase 2 clinical trial. This is where you first start to see whether or not this might have a potential effect at slowing down the progression of ALS. And it also ultimately is looking at that dose for safety again in a larger population of individuals. Then it would move, if it is positive and it looks promising, to a phase 3 clinical trial. These are the ones that are more definitive and are trying to determine whether or not this would actually be a treatment that could be prescribed for people with ALS. If something is positive in a phase 3 clinical trial, then it can be applied to Health Canada for approval here in the country to be prescribed. And I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail, but that is a process that not only is a approval at the federal level with Health Canada, but also a series of reviews that happen to determine whether or not it will be something that can be covered by the provinces under our universal healthcare system. All right. The slide is not moving forward. There we go. Okay, so one of the first things that we are going to talk about today is Edaravone, and a little background on Edaravone very quickly here. Edaravone is something that's called a free radical scavenger. Now, our cells in our body have these things called free radicals that are a byproduct of the production of energy in our cells, as well as something that's produced when there are environmental impacts on our cells. And these can be toxic or damaging to our cellular life. And so you may have heard of antioxidants. These are something that ultimately can affect or scavenge free radicals, and that is something also that Edaravone can do. Now, Edaravone has actually been tested as far back as the 1980s in animal models for stroke, and eventually went through a clinical trial process that allowed it to be approved for stroke as Radicut in 2001 in Japan. It has since become standard of care for stroke in Japan, but it is less known in Europe and North America, as it is not standard of care for stroke here. By the mid-2000s, there were some scientists that decided they wanted to try Edaravone for ALS because ultimately it is believed that antioxidants or free radical scavenging makes sense for potentially slowing down ALS. This then went through a series of clinical trials until recently, originally starting with a wider set of trials where they looked at people who had ALS for 3 years, 3 years or less since diagnosis and less stringent criteria. And what they found was that it was a trend towards a significant benefit, but not that it was significant enough to ultimately be approved for ALS. Upon doing more stringent trials where the individuals were having ALS for 2 years or less, having full breathing capacity, at least over 80% of a particular measure, and having pretty good functional capability across the board. It actually showed 30% slowing of the progression rate in those individuals. And this is then what led to its approval. This is the one diagram I will show you in this backgrounder. As you can see here, that over a 24-week period, those who are on Edaravone versus a placebo, which is ultimately a representative of or a control to measure against, you can see that those individuals declined in their function less rapidly. So a little bit more about that. It was eventually approved based on this criteria, based on this data in Japan in 2015 for ALS. And then, as many of you know, it was approved this past May as Radicava in the United States by the FDA. This then was available in August, and the treatment protocol involves, for the first time that you're taking it, 14 days of consecutive treatments in the first 2 weeks of a month, followed by 2 weeks essentially off of it. And then afterwards, 10 days in the first 2 weeks and 2 weeks off again, and continuing on that protocol. Now, this is the protocol that was originally used for stroke, so that's why they have tried it on ALS in their trials. It doesn't mean that they have had an opportunity to test other potential regimens to know what can happen or the ability for it to protect as a drug in those other regimens. It is an intravenous infusion into the bloodstream. And currently, when people are receiving Radicava in the United States, for example, it is produced in IV bags that already have this at the prescribed dose. Now, there are generic Edaravone that is available in other countries, in Japan and several other countries. And sometimes it is hard to know the quality or contents of that generic Edaravone. It also comes in different vials, and so these must be handled very carefully. That is something that we will talk about possibly with the physicians moving forward. Now, quickly, people want to know, why is Edaravone not approved in Canada? Well, Health Canada cannot approve a rejected treatment until a company who owns the treatment applies for approval. And what we do know at this point is that Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America, which is the company who has Radicava approved in the United States, has been speaking with Health Canada. And we are hopeful that they will apply for it to be approved here in the country. Once it is applied to Health Canada, there are several processes that can take place that can speed up a process from 6 to 12 months down to 6 months or a little bit less. If it is approved in Canada, then a physician can prescribe it, but then it will typically need to be covered in cost by a private health care plan or a private drug care plan. Now, in order to get that widely available on provincial, what we call formularies, to be covered by our healthcare plans in Canada, it then needs to go through a separate set of a review called a common drug review, which happens subsequently, and also another board that talks about what the pricing would be, and they make a recommendation to the provinces as to whether or not they will cover the drug to be used for people who are prescribed in Canada. This process can take quite a while. For many drugs, it can be up to 2 years or more for them to get on provincial formularies. And this is where Health Canada is advocating very strongly, as well as our physicians from CALS, to make sure we can get this as a streamlined process as possible. Because as you can imagine, people with ALS certainly can't wait when something is out there that could be possible to slow down their disease several years to be able to actually get access to it. Very quickly, a couple other key things that are coming down the treatment pipeline. Macedon is a oral pill that is being tested in clinical trials for ALS by a company called AB Science from France. They have currently set up a phase 3 clinical trial that is set to start recruiting soon. The global PI for that study, which is happening in Canada and Europe, is Dr. Angela Genge from the Montreal Neurological Institute. And this is a drug that ultimately targets a reduction in the immune or inflammatory mechanisms of ALS. There's a specific a mechanism why it does this, but I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. In the future, I will be giving webinars that will talk about this in much more detail. What they saw in a trial that ended earlier this year was a phase 2-3 trial where people who were not very rapid progressors ultimately had a slowing of disease by approximately 30%. And you can find this new trial, the phase 3 clinical trial, on clinicaltrials.gov. It should hopefully be recruiting in the next several months. Another one that we get asked about quite a bit is a company called Brainstorm and their particular treatment called Neurone. Brainstorm is a company out of Israel who currently have a phase 3 clinical trial underway at 5 sites in the United States. Ultimately, the idea of this is to extract stem cells from the bone marrow. I will move forward to that part. From the bone marrow of an individual, treat them with this neurone compound, which is to boost the production of supportive factors called growth factors, and then return those cells into the fluid around the spinal cord. And what you'll see above is that this is attempting to slow down the progression of the disease by protecting the existing motor neurons and preserve function for a longer period of time. It is not intended to be something that would replace motor neuron connections and cause a full recovery of the disease. The phase 2 trial, which ended last August, did show a promising slowing of disease progression in the individuals who took it. However, the number was very small, and because it was very small, it's very difficult for us to say with any certainty whether or not it actually works. This is why they have moved forward to a phase 3 clinical trial where 100 people will be treated and 100 people will be on a sham placebo-type treatment. And one of the things is that the chief operating officer is a Canadian neurologist, so the company is aware of Canada, and we are very hopeful that if this is something that does ultimately show promising results in the end, that they would then apply to Health Canada to have it approved here. Saito Kinetics is something you may have heard in the news recently. They have had a drug called tirasemtiv in the pipeline of ALS clinical trials for many years. Most of their drugs are really surrounding around the idea of boosting muscle responses to nerve signals. So as the nerve signals reduce in their strength to the muscles in ALS, the hope was that tirasemtiv could boost that and provide muscle function for a longer period of time. As we saw very recently on November 21st, they released the results of their phase 3 clinical trial, and it ultimately did not replicate what they saw in the previous phase 2 clinical trial, which was a benefit to the reduction in the loss of breathing or a slowing in the loss of breathing in individuals with ALS. It is an oral pill, and it does have some side effects, which are dizziness and nausea, and it was actually believed that the number of people who had to drop out because of those side effects from tirasemtiv may have clouded the ability for this phase 3 trial to replicate the data of the phase 2. That is why they have also got a next generation drug which does what tirasemtiv does functionally, called CK2127-107, but it actually does not have the same side effects of the dizziness and nausea. And they put this forward into a trial, and we are hopeful that, cautiously optimistic, that this may produce the results that they were unable to get with tirasemtiv. And those trials have been run in the United States, Canada, and Europe. So again, these are happening at Canadian sites here. The last one I'm going to talk about is PumasID. PumasID is a well-known schizophrenic drug, also used for tics and other psychoses. It's been used for many years. It is not a commonly used drug, but it is definitely something well-known. And amongst a screening panel of thousands of drugs, and you may have seen this in the news recently, by Dr. Pierre Grapeau and Dr. Alex Parker, who have models of fish and worms, respectively, of ALS, they found that that PumasID actually slowed the motor neuron degeneration and the paralysis effects in these particular animals. They then moved to collaborators in mice and found that, in fact, it could strengthen the junction between the muscles and the motor neurons. Now, this was then, that group then spoke to Dr. Lawrence Korngut at the University of Calgary, who set up a small 25-person clinical trial to find an optimal dose that could be used for a larger trial in ALS. There are some side effects to this drug, so it must be monitored very carefully. This does not preclude it from potentially being something that could be used for ALS, but must be monitored very closely. And as part of an ALS Canada Brain Canada grant that we are funding, a Hudson Translational Team grant, there will be a 100-participant clinical trial across 9 Canadian ALS sites that has begun recruiting in Calgary and hopefully be able to be recruiting in other Canadian sites soon. We do not know yet if it will be effective, but like other ones, we're cautiously optimistic. And please go to our ALS.ca website under the research portal for webinars, and you can find Dr. Korngut's webinar from our virtual research forum earlier this year. There are many more things that are out there. I'm not going to talk on these in detail. However, I will talk about these in a much more detailed webinar in 2018, but due to our early technical difficulties that we had, I'm going to move on to our panelists, who we are very happy to have online. I would like to quickly introduce them. We have from Fredericton at the Stan Cassidy Center for Rehabilitation, Dr. Colleen OConnell, who leads the ALS program there. We have Dr. Geneviève Matt, who leads the ALS program at the CHUM Université de Montréal ALS Clinic. We have Dr. Wendy Johnston, who along with Dr. Colleen OConnell are co-chairs of the Canadian ALS Research Network of Clinics. She is the director of the Edmonton ALS Clinic and the director of the ALS Clinic at the London Health Sciences Centre, Dr. Christen Shoesmith. So hopefully you can all hear me now, and I can stop talking and move it on to you. Are you all there?
We're all here, I think.
Great.
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. Let's move forward here. So I'm going to start maybe with Dr. Johnston. What do you say to people who want to know your medical opinion on whether they should take Edaravone if they have ALS, and will it help their ALS?
That's quite a discussion that has to balance the impact of having an intensive intravenous therapy over many months versus the other goals that the individuals have for their living with ALS. Taking that into account, we then review the indications, and the study that prompted the approval in Japan and in the US showed convincing changes in the differences between the groups treated and untreated, and a follow-up publication showing that those who then went on to take the drug after the randomized period, that is, those who were on placebo started on therapy and those who were on drug continued with therapy, showed that these differences persisted. That was convincing enough to get approval, although typically most approvals are based on 2 positive studies. We then review the ALS-FRS, which we use routinely in our clinic, so that they can assess whether the changes are meaningful to them, because the 2.5 point difference after 6 months in this study group was statistically significant, and therefore is quite impressive compared to the couple of dozen other studies that we have participated in. So I had pulled up the ALS-FRS. Did you have a slide of that by any chance, David? Those individuals listening who don't know the ALS-FRS, it's a series of standard questions covering many of the important symptoms of ALS. And in the study that was positive, those that participated had to be at a certain level. And for example, for speech, they had to have intelligible speech, although with repeating. For handwriting, they at least had to be able to write, even if all words were not legible. And for respiratory support, they had to use continuous use of BiPAP during the night only. So it limited the study to people who were fairly uniform. And then they looked at those who showed measurable change. So they honed in on a group that was uniform enough to actually show whether the drug had benefit over a short period of 6 months. That's what we go over. And then we go into the individual's particularities as to whether it might be efficacious at this time in their ALS, comparing it to their ALS-FRS scores, and then identifying what would be the goal of the therapy. For example, if there's someone who has tremendous involvement but one area, but really wants intensive therapy to slow progression in another, even though they don't meet criteria from the positive study, that might be a goal that prompts them to be interested in pursuing Edaravone therapy at this time when it is not yet available in Canada, because of the costs and the other implications that involves. Long-winded, but it takes quite a discussion with every individual patient and family.
Great. Would you have anything to add, Dr. Shoesmith or Dr. Matt O'Connell?
It's Christen Shoesmith. One of the things that I just like to highlight with what Wendy said is that patients really need to be aware that this medication isn't going to make them better. The main goal of this medication is to slow the deterioration of their disease. And that is one of the main misconceptions that patients come into clinic with, is that they've heard that this medication will make them better. And so we spend a lot of time going over that, and I do discuss with them that the difference with the patients who were on this medication with the study versus those who were not on the medication deteriorated in both groups, but the people who were on Edaravone deteriorated less by a less amount compared to the other group. So I think it's so important just to focus on the patients that this medication is not going to improve their function. Now, most of the ALS community does not feel that this medication is going to improve the function. We have to remember that there's an important concept that is a very real concept called the placebo effect. The placebo effect is a concept where patients who are given a medication believe that they're going to get better and experience improvement. And this is a real effect with biological basis behind it. So much so that patients with Parkinson's disease, because of the way it works, actually truly improve with it because of the placebo effect. And because this medication is so expensive, it has a very strong chance of having a placebo effect, because it's well documented that the more expensive a therapy is, the more likely a patient is going to experience a placebo effect. So we also talk about the fact that we don't think that there's going to be improvement of the medication.
Great. Before we move on, I was wondering, s'il vous plaît, Dr. Matt, pouvez-vous résumer pour les personnes qui écoutent en français?
Oui, pas de problème. Donc, on a posé la question d'abord à Dr. Johnston. Qu'est-ce que vous dites aux patients qui souffrent de SLA et qui veulent recevoir de l'Edaravone? Donc, en fait, c'est réfléchir aux effets, à l'impact d'un traitement en intraveineuse, intensif, d'un médicament coûteux, versus leurs autres besoins, leurs autres objectifs lorsqu'ils vivent avec la maladie. Ça implique revoir les données. Donc, voir la différence entre les groupes, puis réaliser que c'était des patients hautement sélectionnés et voir si ça correspond à leurs objectifs, s'ils correspondent au profil, si on peut dire, qui était dans la recherche. Puis Dr. Shoesmith, qui a suivi, nous a dit que il faut quand même avoir des attentes réalistes avec le médicament. C'est un médicament qu'on pense qu'il peut ralentir la progression de la maladie, mais ne pas améliorer le sort, la fonction du patient. Donc, il y a probablement une grosse part d'effet placebo dans les articles qui sont trouvés dans les médias. Puis l'effet placebo est très puissant.
Merci. Merci. And so, Dr. O'Connell or Dr. Matt, do you have anything to add to that in terms of in terms of what has been said so far?
It's Colleen OConnell from Fredericton. I just want to, and I think maybe, David, you reflected this a bit in your introductory comments, and you know, even though our messages may sound a little cautionary, unfortunately, it's sometimes the role of a clinician to be, you know, we always want to be supportive of hope and not take away that very positive feeling that one gets with having a drug for the first time. I mean, it is extremely exciting. It's been over 20 years since there's been an agent that has shown to have this positive benefit for patients. And so my approach really is, like Dr. Johnston said, is very much individualized. It's important, you know, the relationship you have with your patient, and I go over the results of the studies as we know them. I reflect on how important a discovery this is and what it means to the ALS community, and then we go through the practicalities of what it would mean to get and to use this drug and what the expectation should be.
Okay. So if there isn't anything more on that part, and we can certainly circle back to it, I wanted to know, you know, we have a lot of people who ask questions about, you know, how do you obtain a Edaravone in Canada? Do they need to go to Japan if they want it? And then to follow up on that, and we maybe start with that, is, you know, if someone has purchased a Darvon and obtained it here in Canada, they would like to know how they can get it infused. So I'm wondering if maybe we could start with maybe Dr. Matt, even in terms of, you know, how do people obtain it if they want to know?
Yes, well, some patients have been to Japan. I must say I don't know the name of the physician in Japan that offers to prescribe it and supervise the first set of infusion, or patients may import it from Japan, a generic brand, for 3 months supply at a time. As far as Quebec is concerned, none of my patients has been ahead with the process. So, but there may be a few hurdles into getting the medication ingested IV, but it's doable. I think some other provinces have it a little better organized now. I think in Alberta, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's been individual responses across the country. We can get into that.
Sure. So would anyone like to add to that in terms of someone who wants to know how they can obtain it, or what you would say if somebody asked you the question about how to obtain it?
I can start with that. Oh.
Sure, Dr. Shoesmith maybe, and then Dr. O'Connell.
Sure. So I've had a few patients start on Edaravone after having conversations in clinic about what the medication has chance to do, and discussing with the patient whether I feel that there would be a good chance for a benefit, or what kind of benefit we can potentially predict for that individual patient, and going through the discussion about IV therapy. If a patient decides to go ahead with at least searching out the medication, we obviously have a discussion about the fact that it's not approved yet in Canada, but patients are obtaining the medication through different sources. So one option would be to go to the States, but that would be a very expensive option at this stage because they'd have to pay face value price for the medication. Another option would be to go to Japan themselves, although most patients have not had to actually take themselves to Japan. They've been able to contact the physician, or at least the physician assistant who was part of the original trial, for the Edaravone trial, and they can import that medication into Canada with 3 months supply that Dr. Matt had referred to. Once they have their medication, then they do need a physician to write a request for a nurse to do the infusion within the province of Ontario. In Ontario, the decision has been made with the LHINs that the majority of the LHINs, which is our local health integration networks, essentially regional health authorities, that they will not cover the cost of the infusions within Ontario. So the majority of patients who decide to take the medication do have to go through a private infusion clinic. And there's 2 private infusion clinics within our province that are willing to administer the medication. Both of those clinics are run by nurses, so the nurses do the infusions for the patients. And the infusions occur over an hour, and the patients are usually watched for at least 30 minutes to an hour after the infusion to make sure that there's no significant side effects that happen. And then the patient is sent home. Those private infusion clinics cost around $250 per infusion. So as you can probably gather, the cost of the infusion can ramp up very quickly, because for the first cycle of this course, it's 14 days, so 7 days a week for 2 weeks. So that is the first monthly cost, and then the month after that would be a monthly cost of the 10 treatments. So that's already $2,500 just for that month. That's in addition to the cost of the medication that the patient has acquired. So it's a very expensive process for most patients at this stage, which unfortunately is a limiting factor factor until there'll be provincial coverage for these patients. And I have not had any success with anybody applying to their insurance company to get approval for their insurance company, and that's because this medication is not approved in Canada yet. I think that's all I needed to say about that, David.
Okay, great. So, you know, keeping in mind that things are different in different provinces, I was wondering if maybe we could also hear from the other clinicians as well, in terms of, you know, how they would approach this situation of somebody asking about it. So maybe Dr. Johnston or Dr. O'Connell, I think you were speaking before.
Sure. Here in New Brunswick, we only have, we're kind of small, so we're only 2 health regions. And in my conversations with we have a unique program here in New Brunswick where we have what's called a home-based hospital program, where we have essentially full therapeutic teams that see and follow patients directly in their homes. And we're checking on right now, checking on having those administrations done directly in a patient's home. Problem with our outpatient clinics and coming into hospital, which there would be no charge for that, and it would be under the supervision of our outpatient infusion clinics. They don't operate on weekends, and so where this drug has a continuous 14 or 10-day infusion, we're really looking at home-based solutions. And at this point right now, sorry, I'm getting an echo, but we're looking at the options for home base and with no charge. And to date, though, we have not had any patients who have moved forward with acquiring the drug from Japan.
So in Alberta, although we are ostensibly one health region in policy, we are effectively 3 or so for specialist diseases. Dr. Corngut was successful in having the infusion clinic at the hospital where the ALS clinic is based agree to do the infusions in the clinic, in their infusion clinic. The patient who obtains the drug from Japan brings the vials in and shows them to one of the neurologists, who then approves it and writes the orders. We are in the process of identifying that same procedure here, and we anticipate we will also be offering it through the hospital-based infusion clinics. The private infusion clinics are also available, but the cost is quite prohibitive. In addition, those patients who have successfully infused Edaravone in my practice, one so far, have utilized their medical connections to have the infusion done at their convenience. I have insisted that the first infusion be done under supervision, and the subsequent infusions are done by appropriate personnel, physicians or doctors. The infusions have been by an IV in a vein in the arm. We have not yet moved to having an IV in a big central vein, although given how many IVs are going to be required, that might be an option down the road. We are looking into having our home-based infusion service also provide in-home, and once the main hospitals, especially hospitals, have adopted this, I anticipate the home infusion services will follow. The barriers have been the fact that it is not approved in Canada, and in the nursing union and the nursing liability organization has been hesitant to authorize the nurses in Alberta to undertake the infusion, but they're not opposed to it. They just wish to examine the risks and potential liabilities. The Canadian Medical Protective Association, which is our liability coverage, has indicated they have no problem with the doctors and their liability. So as doctors, we feel reassured by our insurers that this is permissible. Individual doctors, however, may or may not be comfortable doing the orders. I made the decision that I will, as has Dr. Korngut. I think the nursing jurisdiction, their union, and their liability insurance is province by province, and I think in Quebec, for example, Geneviève, that has been a barrier.
Yes, this has been the major hurdle so far.
So thank you for that. Dr. Matt, peut-être pouvez-vous résumer pour for the things that you said about Quebec?
Oui, avec plaisir.
Reiterate for individuals en français?
Avec plaisir. Donc, on me demandait comment on peut obtenir de l'Edaravone. Donc, les façons qu'on a vues sont d'aller au Japon, rencontrer un médecin qui accepte de le prescrire et de superviser la première série d'injections. Sinon, il y a des façons de l'importer pour une quantité là, de 3 mois à la fois. Dans toutes les provinces, il y a des barrières à l'infusion. Au Québec, une grosse semble être l'Ordre des infirmières du Québec, qui, donc, dans leur code d'éthique et puis avec leur protection, là, leur assurance responsabilité semble ne pas pouvoir injecter de médicaments non approuvés. Mais je dois dire que si quelqu'un voulait vraiment passer le pas puis l'importer, on pourrait sûrement trouver une façon de s'entendre.
Merci. Okay, so I think you know, there are a lot of questions people have in terms of you know, how, for example, Dr. Matt, how would one want to go about trying to convince the Order of Nurses in Quebec to provide this service? Do you think that's possible? What would you say to someone who asked a question about that?
Well, we have to look at what other fields in medicine have done, and there are some non-approved drugs in Canada that are sometimes imported or obtained through a special access program and are injected, for instance, in hematology oncology. So I think if we draw from those precedents, we could there would be some room to treat patients with Edaravone in Quebec.
So before we move on to, you know, other parts of the pipeline, the treatment pipeline that are out there, does anyone have anything to add in particular that they feel are questions they may be getting about Edaravone that have not been covered?
Can I just add something? It's Christen Shoesmith. So I wanted just to backtrack a little bit on my comments earlier, because I know that Colleen had made a point saying that it sounds that I'm being a bit disparaging. And I think because we all realize how expensive this therapy is for our patients because they still have to pay for it. We have to make sure that the patients know the cost and what the benefit is. We're almost certainly going to have a different approach when we prescribe this medication when it's approved in Canada, because there is evidence that it is effective. So our tact with our patients will be different when we do not have to worry about how this might affect a patient financially. I worry about some of our patients making decisions about their finances. We have one individual which decided to do this and cashed in her RSPs for it. So those type of decisions we do get concerned about. I mind you, of course, these are always the patient's decisions, and we are just there to give them the information to make their own decisions. But it's so important for patients to realize what they're getting into, what are the costs involved, and what benefits that they can potentially get. This does not mean that it's not effective therapy. There is evidence that it is effective. It's just that we have to explain to them what is the effect of the medication, what benefits or trajectory change are they going to potentially see.
Great. And I think all of that also speaks to the fact that, you know, as all of you in CALS as well as ALS Canada and our federated partners across the country can continue to push to make the Canadian system as welcoming as possible to new therapies and as streamlined as possible so that these therapies can come with full coverage, hopefully, to people living with ALS.
So I wanted to add 2 more things. So this is Wendy Johnston. For those who are listening on the webinar who have already received their Edaravone or in the process of receiving it, we understand that there are differing opinions as to how it will be administered. The interested and supportive physician in Japan is now recommending that the infusions be done 5 days a week from the beginning. And continue at 5 days a week rather than the 14 days off, 14 days on the infusion, 14 days off, and then 10 days and so on. So patients have found this confusing, and we have found it confusing. We recognize that those in Japan who've had the benefit of using the drug may have bowed to pragmatic considerations to do it as a usual business hours type infusion. We have tended to, for our patients, recommend we follow the guidelines from the original studies until such time as further studies provide us the information about the comparing the 2 methods and then answering perhaps questions about how long to continue. The second point I've lost track of, it was something that was prompted by Christen. Just about the balancing pros and cons. Many people are very enthusiastic to start and then wonder how long should I go on? And the studies that showed the benefit were 6 months, and then the open label studies go on to demonstrate that there was a continued difference between the groups depending on whether they had placebo first or Edaravone first. Safety issues appear to be not a great concern. A lot of the side effects in the Edaravone group had to do with the infusion itself compared to placebo, and then some more difficulty with walking. I'm not aware that stopping the infusions has been associated with any concern about withdrawal or adverse effects. The drug is only in your system for less than 24 hours, so it doesn't linger, and the chances for long-term side effects or for there to be a withdrawal, it just does not appear to be a concern.
Okay, great. So I guess if we round out the Darvon conversation, is there anything anyone would like to add?
I guess just to complete Wendy's points, though, is patients will ask us, well, how long should I continue on the medication? And we really do not know the answer to that. Because the evidence is really only up to a year. We don't know whether or not there's ongoing benefits after that year time. So when patients are budgeting for how long they should be on the medication for, we truly have to say we do not know how long you should be on the medication, or is there a point in time where the medication does stop its efficacy. And just from the safety perspective, in the same vein, we assume that there's no long-term side effects of the medication, but because there isn't the data out there to really look at, we don't know that for certain. And then the question that Wendy raised as well about whether patients should be on it on a weekly basis without any extended holiday periods off is another challenge that we don't have the answer. It certainly might be a better protocol, knowing that the current protocol was only delivered as such because that was what was used in stroke. And they just continued what was used in stroke. So we may find, once studies are done, that daily treatments, which is weekends off, may be a better treatment plan for this disease. Just we don't have that evidence yet to say that one way or the other.
And finally, following up on Christen's point, because Mitsubishi Tanabe is going to submit to Health Canada, I think it's pragmatic to suggest those moving forward to order the drug from Japan should count on a year's supply, hope that we have more answers, and hope that we have access to an approved drug in Canada by the time that year is up. So I think we should be hopeful that that will take away a lot of this uncertainty and individuality of how the drug is covered and delivered.
And that is a really important point, Wendy, because having that hope for all patients is so important. So telling them that this is coming and they do need to be patient for the medication to be approved is an important conversation that we have on a daily basis with our patients.
So, so I would like to maybe take an opportunity in the last 15 minutes to just focus on a couple other things in the pipeline that we can take this opportunity to get your opinions on. So first of all, recently we've heard a lot about PumasID in the news, and that it has been a very successful translational study from the lab to the clinic in Canada in terms of getting it to the clinic. And I was wondering if maybe you could comment on, your thoughts on the PumasID trials that are forthcoming. Maybe start back with Dr. Johnston again.
So the PumasID trial is different because it is a drug that there's a lot of information about the side effects, and we know quite a bit about how those taking it for other conditions have experienced side effects. This has influenced how we are looking at which patients will benefit. So PumasID is not going to be a panacea. Not everyone with ALS will be offered PumasID because there's a higher risk of certain side effects depending on how the ALS is affecting you. So for those who are quite keen to get started on this homegrown study, yay for the home team, I think that you will have to hear your participating clinics selection criteria. There is an extensive list of medications that are going to make people ineligible to volunteer. And we don't wish to put patients in the position of choosing between medications that are already helpful in treating current conditions when the benefit of PumasID, while hopeful, is still to be demonstrated. When we are talking with people about inclusion in the PumasID study, we'll be emphasizing who's going to most likely benefit, which patients are most likely to experience intolerable side effects, and we'll go through the drug lists very carefully so that we don't put patients at risk of drug interactions. If your clinic is participating or you choose to go to a participating center, you must be very upfront with your medication lists, because the last thing we want to do is make life more difficult.
Great. Does anyone have anything to add, or because also it would be fantastic, Dr. Matt, if you could maybe summarize some of that as well en français.
Oui, avec plaisir encore. Donc, on parlait de l'étude de PumasID, puis en fait, bon, c'est des chercheurs du CHUM quand même qui ont fait le screening de cette molécule. Et puis, c'est un bel exemple de recherche translationnelle. L'avantage, comme Dr. Johnston mentionnait, c'est qu'on connaît bien les effets secondaires de ce médicament-là, puisqu'on s'en sert depuis de nombreuses années dans d'autres populations. Cependant, il faut réaliser qu'on ne sait pas encore chez l'humain combien de bénéfices on peut escompter. Mais on sait qu'il y a un risque certain pour des effets secondaires chez certains patients, soit de par leur condition médicale antérieure, soit à cause des médicaments qu'ils prennent déjà. Il peut y avoir beaucoup d'interactions médicamenteuses, donc il va falloir se poser la question, est-ce qu'il y a plus de bénéfices à participer à l'étude mais abandonner certains médicaments que le patient prend déjà, ou est-ce que, ben non, finalement, il y a plus de risques d'avoir du tort si on prend du PumasID et qu'on devrait plutôt continuer aux médicaments actuels et peut-être attendre un autre essai clinique.
Merci. Does anyone would like to add anything else on PumasID or thoughts or?
So I guess one of the questions that will come up frequently, David, is whether patients should just ask their physician to be on PumasID because it's an already available medication. And this comes up quite commonly in clinic where there's a medication that's being studied that is already available. And so should we put patients on this, or should a physician agree to write the prescription? This is a challenging question, and there's not really a good answer to this. The easiest thing to do is to chat with the patients about the fact that we do not know if there's going to be benefit from the medication. And the medication is also not without its side effects, particularly the restlessness, internal restlessness that can happen with this medication. So that's certainly something that we can discuss with the patients. If the patient is going to be eligible for the clinical trial, it may be worthwhile talking to them about the importance of being involved in a clinical trial, and that there is evidence that people who participate in clinical trials do better regardless of whether or not they're on the placebo arm or whether or not they're on the treatment arm, and so that can help. There's also the whole concept of that it's really important to contribute to ALS research so that other patients behind them can know if there's an effect of that one medication. But if it's someone who is not going to be eligible for a clinical trial, potentially because they're not in a region that's offering the clinical trial, or we know from the inclusion criteria that they're not going to be potentially eligible, it is worth considering, with the proviso that it's worth a little bit of warning that in other trials, so historically in other ALS clinical trials, medications that have been available, that have been prescribed outside of the clinical trial, have done a couple things. One is it slowed the recruitment of the clinical trial, so it slowed the answer to know if that clinical trial has been effective. And the other is that in most of these situations, it's been found that there's been no benefit, and even in the case of minocycline, which is the most famous example, there was actually harm from the treatment. So patients who were given minocycline outside of that clinical trial did worse than those that were on the medication. So these are all like really complicated concepts, and that are just worth discussing for these patients. But in the end, it still might be worth a consideration to prescribe it to a patient who wouldn't have been otherwise eligible, depending on their considerations.
May I add, this is Wendy, that Dr. Bedlack recently did a study with a novel design for Lunacy, and one of the outcomes of his study was that those who chose to participate on their own but kept reporting their status tended to stay on the Lunacy only for 6 months. So I think that when you're using a drug without knowing really if it's going to work, and without knowing if your participation will be of use to others, it's a little harder to stick with it. If you recall, the benefit of riluzole and the benefit of Edaravone was only seen in slowing down the progression, not in cure. So we dream of the day where we have a cure that's really easy to see. But for many of these drugs, it's hard for you to know as an individual if it's working. And that's something to talk about with your physician if you're going to take it off label. Is it worth the potential side effects? And at what point would you stop it, and why?
Great. Thank you very much. So I think also an interesting follow-up to what Dr. Shoesmith said as well is that even in the articles that have surrounded the PumasID discussion lately in the media, Dr. Korngut has said himself that he is not recommending that people are taking PumasID off-label as someone who's using it currently from the previous clinical trial. So, reiterating what you'd said, Dr. Shoesmith. I'm going to quickly just switch to something, because one of the questions I get a lot in the office is that, for a lot of people, they didn't necessarily know that Edaravone was available in Japan for ALS in 2015, and then it became more widely known when the FDA approved it this year. And I think a lot of people wonder if there are things out there in other countries that exist that Canada can't access or Canadians are not able to access that are helping people living with ALS in other countries. And I'm wondering if maybe Dr. O'Connell, could you speak to that?
I don't really have a great comment or a good insight on that one, David.
Okay, I think maybe if I frame it differently.
Yes.
So a lot of people are going to other countries for stem cell treatments, or they're, for example, quickly, I think a lot of people will see that the Brainstorm clinical trial is happening at 5 sites in the United States, and they want to know, well, why is it not happening in Canada? And what I failed to mention before was that companies decide where they want to put their dollars into a clinical trial and what sites they want to use, and that wasn't for necessarily a lack of Canadian sites wanting to be involved. And so I think some people get the feeling that there may be things out there that would help them, or they could go get in another country, and they're not getting access to because they live in Canada. And I was just wondering if maybe you could speak to that. But if not, we can move to.
I guess it's a bit of a difficult question, because in some ways the patients are right. If you lived in the United States and you happen to live in an area that was in a certain geographic distance from one of the sites where one of the stem cell trials was going on, you could potentially get involved. And I know I have had patients who have had American citizenship try to take advantage of that and be able to get involved. I had one patient who participated in numerous clinical trials that were conducted south of the border. And I think one of the, and if I can maybe just take it to that personal level in the experience with that patient, a lot of that travel ended up meaning a lot of time away from home, and it was not necessarily something that as a family had been taken into account, and unfortunately a lot of his time was spent traveling and looking for that. I think deep down he really felt he was looking for a cure, which, as many of us who work in the field realize, with decades of research, that cure is not being kept in secret by someone who has found it and is only giving it to a few select patients. And sometimes I feel like that might be the perception or the feeling that people get when they hear about opportunities in other countries. And often they might be participating in a blog or participating in a chat room or something online, and they hear, always the person who has found something that has reversed or changed their disease. But Dr. Shoesmith was really explaining, this placebo effect, the effect that maybe 10% of patients don't necessarily have the correct diagnosis initially, or who have a variant of the disease that's incredibly slow progressive, and so you can't take those sort of one-offs of or individual cases that may have had some type of treatment in some clinic or therapy that's not necessarily part of what is felt to be an ethical clinical trial. But what is, the learnings from other countries do help us, and certainly Edaravone, for instance, and maybe what's happening with Hôpital and Macedon are things that have developed and identified in other countries and are making their way here. I think what's important is that Canada is recognized as being an incredibly diligent country in terms of ensuring the research that we do with patients is ethical, and that it is the balance of patient safety is not being compromised with the risk that patients are willing to take. And some things that are posed as trials in other countries, in fact, are not trials. An individual should never have to pay in order to participate in a trial, and what may be purported to be a trial in another country is in fact not. It's a clinic maybe doing a treatment with something that's not yet proven and putting the funding of that onto the backs of patients, and that's just not acceptable in Canada. So David, I think, you know, my approach with patients is and with their families and as individuals is what the other doctor said as well. It's very much an individual approach. It's a discussion about risk and benefit and your values and your objectives and looking at solutions that are optimum for that patient. But I don't feel that Canadians are being restricted or prevented from participating in world-class research, and I think Canada has a reputation that is growing in being able to attract these world-class and well-done trials.
David?
Thank you. Yeah.
It's 3 o'clock. Do we have any ability to go overtime, or are we going to wrap up?
Well, that's a good question. I suppose if you all are willing to stay online, we can continue. But perhaps before we go into overtime, let me just quickly say, for those of you who are listening and who have until 5 o'clock, and possibly anyone on the panel, thank you so much to the panel. We really appreciate it. We hope to be able to do more of these in the future. Certainly there are more clinical questions than we can answer in a discussion like this, but we will aim for all of those questions that came in to find a way to get those answers back to you. A lot of those that I see can be answered individually, and I will be able to get back to you on those. So thank you all, for anyone that has to leave, for attending, and I guess we start a little bit into overtime. So Dr. Johnston, you wanted to, and if anyone needs to leave the call, please, by all means, do so.
Okay, because I actually put it in my calendar for an hour and a half for some reason. So I wanted to follow, and Christen or any of the others, if you want to jump in because you have to leave, please do, because I did allocate additional time. Okay, I can go ahead?
Yes.
So I had a follow-up on that question, which is a really excellent question, David. And I would like to, before I forget, I want to address concerns of those people listening or participating who don't have a relationship with one of the CALS sites. So I think in our discussions about the concerns of Federation partners, the ALS Society has brought to our attention that the discussions that we have with our patients are not always available to people with ALS in our very dispersed Canadian population. People may have been seen once for diagnosis, being followed by a neurologist or by a rehabilitation doctor who is providing all the care but doesn't have the research questions and is really struggling to answer questions. So one of the things we should do as a CALS group is to come up with the way to continue to inform and have individuals feel they can access these therapies in the same way that Canadians in large centers do. So that's something that we can come back to. So further to the question, David, sorry, go ahead. Did someone want to jump in? Okay. The question about, you know, grass is always greener, or what in the social media age is called FOMO, fear of missing out, I think we all have that. You know, and in ALS it's so critical because this fear that there's some advantage elsewhere adds to the uncertainty and the burden of coping. What I think Edaravone did was it was approved in Japan. It was available. A generic was available. Most of the research drugs are not approved anywhere in the world, and so no one else is using unless it's studied. Many therapies are advocated or advertised or promoted as being beneficial, but they are without proof. So that's part of the information gathering that you're going through, or a family member, that's so difficult. And if you feel comfortable bringing this back to your doctor, that's what I think. To the end of travel to go to one of these sites, like the Brainstorm sites in the U.S., you have to recall that when you're participating in research, you need to be participating for the good of all. And if you're doing it only for yourself, then that's going to be harder on you. And the site that is offering the trial has their first responsibility to do a safe trial, and their second responsibility is to do it the best way possible to get an answer. And so they are not going to take a risk on someone from a great distance who may not be able to complete the study, even if the patient and family have the greatest goodwill in seeking to participate. So when we do studies, we have to make sure we're not going to cause harm, and we have to make sure that we'll be able to reach the endpoint that is informative. If you refer back to David's slide on the tirasemtiv trial, through nobody's fault, it looked like any meaningful response might have been missed because people just couldn't take the dose that might have been effective. That's one of the interpretations. So if we look at trying to get a study done in a small amount of time with the smallest number of patients, you need everyone to really commit to finishing and to do it in a way that's safe. So just to reflect on what you really want to get out of access to a new treatment and how that beats with the goals of the place that's doing the treatment. David, do you have a comment on that as a scientist? Are you there, David?
Hello, I am here. No, I'm here. I just wasn't sure if we were done. Okay, so I mean that's really great because I know that one of the questions I get frequently is about exactly that there are so many things people want to try, and you know, we refer them to the neurologist first and try to provide some information, but it's always good to get you know, it right straight from each of you in terms of your feelings on those situations. So, you know, if I were to dig into, you know, another question or two then, and I think we've covered a lot of the ones we wanted. You know, someone wanted to ask, we had a question that came in during the webinar, which is that, you know, a lot of people have been taking Edaravone already in Canada, and there were some questions around whether or not you know if the official Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America drug comes to Canada and does get approved, does that change the status for people getting the generic? And also, since it's not on a clinical trial and people are taking it, is there anyone that you know of who's obtaining data from people who are taking the drug? The generic, my apologies.
So, am I the only one on still?
You might be.
I'm here. Colleen's here.
Okay.
Why don't one of you guys take that, and I won't talk so much.
So I think that the one question is the access, the personal importation ability to bring that in from Japan going to be affected by approval of the medication by Health Canada? And I know that we are also worried about that shutting down, but I don't know if we know if that is actually a fact, because we haven't heard from Health Canada whether or not that would be still open or not if there's approval of the medication. Because there is, as David had mentioned in his opening slides, this period of time where we will get approval by Health Canada, and unless you have private insurance coverage for the medication, the provincial formularies will probably not put it on for most likely a 6-month period of time. One of the things I was going to mention before, David, I just think it's so important to mention, is that the patient advocacy for approval of these medications is really, really important. I've been watching the SMA drug Spinraza proceed through the process. So Spinraza is a first-in-class medication and really the first treatment for spinal muscular atrophy that was just approved by Health Canada in June. Patients are having obviously difficulty getting it because of the cost of the medication, and the Common Drug Review is going through, but it's been with pressure both on Health Canada to approve it quickly as well as pressure to get it on the provincial formularies. through patient advocacy groups that has moved the process along quickly. So I think it is, if patients wonder what they can do, it is truly advocating for your access to these medications that will be helpful when the drug is applied to Health Canada to try to get this done quickly, as well as advocacy at the provincial levels to get this covered at the provincial formulary levels.
Great. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So, I reiterate what you just said as important is that when we do know that the drug might be applied to Health Canada, that's when people can really benefit, or when their advocacy efforts and their push on it can help. As of right now, we don't know that there is any particular submission in. So for those listening, you know, stay tuned.
So I think as relates to Health Canada, when Dr. O'Connell and I met with Health Canada in September, we understood that the current importation that people can do privately, which is the access now of the generic from Japan. The generic from Japan is the only one that physicians in Canada will be prescribing. They will not be doing generics from other manufacturers. But that is under an exemption for a drug that is not approved in Canada. When Mitsubishi Tanabe will do their submission, up until the time that it's approved by Health Canada, that personal importation, I think, is still valid. Once it is approved, it will you'll no longer be allowed to import it yourself. But there'll be a gap while it's still being determined who will pay for it. So returning to the advocacy, much of the progress we made since June on access to Edaravone has come from patient advocacy, and we've scrambled a bit to keep up. And we're very fortunate that we have collaborative and open patients who shared with us and with the patients their experience and advice. You have to advocate locally in your health authority. You have to get on the email, on social media to Health Canada to say that this is not just another drug for blood pressure. These drugs need to be rapidly assessed, both by Health Canada and by your individual provinces. And it's the voice of patients that really make the difference. And we've seen that in ALS, we've seen that in other conditions, as Dr. Shoesmith pointed out. So don't underestimate your ability to make change in your community.
Okay. I'm actually going to, since we have you in overtime, I'm actually going to switch gears to a quick question, which is, you know, if I went around the panel very briefly, and you can duplicate answers on this, but of the treatments that are out there, are there any that we haven't spoken about that you think are particularly interesting, or that you have some excitement around in terms of certainly cautious optimism moving forward? So maybe we start with, if you're still there, Dr. Matt?
Yes. Well, you mentioned earlier masitinib, which I think is interesting from so some data, preliminary data in humans came out last spring, and this medication addresses neuroinflammation, which is an interesting target, which failed in the past, though, in past clinical trials, but then this molecule seems to be more specific. So I'm not too sure what to make of the fact that it seems to work better in slow progressors, but once we're in a bigger clinical trials in humans and with stratification, we might get answers. But the animal data is very promising. The animals seem to do a lot better. So that's the one I would check on over the next few months, years.
Great. So maybe moving over to Dr. O'Connell, do you have anything in particular you would add to that conversation?
Well, I'm interested in what the outcome around the cannabinoids are going to be. You know, in some of the animal models, some of the synthetic cannabinoids or extracts that with isolates have shown some activity in the mouse model, and then of course at the sort of clinical, the actual plant products or extracts from the plant, and the suggestion that they may be helpful in some of the symptom management. So I'm certainly excited about those. I'm getting talking.
Pardon me. Okay, so anyone else have anything to add to that?
Well, this is Wendy. I'm reflecting on my, I think, longer experience than anyone else on this panel in doing clinical trials. What I see is we don't only have an upsurge in clinical trials. We have, this has been, since I returned to Canada from the US, this is the most number of clinical trials that have been active and offered to Canadians. And I think this is partly because of the Canadian ALS Research Group are coming together. I think it's partly because of the heterogeneity, the fact that when your doctor tells you you have ALS, they may tell you that there's a lot of differences between patients and everyone's course is different, and that's made it harder to know what actually will work. And so this recognition of subtypes, like saying maybe it's the slower progressors that masitinib is for. Maybe we have to look at other markers. Maybe there's going to be smart therapies, for example, if you have a gene abnormality. The other thing is the goal, the target of the therapies is quite different between these different trials. And we know from other conditions that when you target different parts of the pathway that lead to the disease, you may have a cumulative benefit that's better than any single drug alone. So the fact that we're looking at a muscle stimulant and in the setting of having a free radical scavenger, that we're looking at drugs that are fighting inflammation, we're beginning to look at combination therapy that we only discussed in a theoretical way 10 years ago. So I'm excited that these investigations are aiming at different mechanisms. It may mean that we're going to polydrug therapy that will become quite personalized based on how ALS is progressing. This highlights the importance of other research that's being done that is not about drug trials, but is about understanding how to read the ALS. So there are studies going on to say, is there a blood test, is there a urine test, is there a brain scan that can show us the effect of a drug, and will that help us select people who will benefit from that drug or that treatment? So it's getting very complicated in the best of ways, because we might have a menu to choose from in the coming years as we individualize therapies to the different ways ALS affects people.
Okay, and I'm not sure if Dr. Shoesmith, you're still here, whether there's anything you'd like to add.
I would echo everything that's been said already, but I would just add I'm so excited to hear the results of the NeuroOwn study, because stem cells take up so much conversation in our clinics, and just to have an answer as to whether or not there's any benefit from that trial or another trial would be very helpful for discussions with patients. And I realize that the NeuroOwn study is not necessarily the only way to deliver stem cells, but it's a very well thought out way. The stem cells through that trial are there to deliver a particular series of neurotransmitters, and so it's a very well thought out way to deliver them, and I really think that mechanism is the way that we're going to go forward in the future if this stem cell therapy works, using the stem cells not as a way to replace the cells that have died, because those in science don't feel that that's the way stem cells are going to work, but as a drug delivery system or a sop-up of protein aggregates or something to that effect may be of benefit. And
to that point, I think it's it's also quite interesting that, you know, even if stem cells provide that kind of a protective support, there may be other ways in the future that we can actually deliver that same type of support. There's viral mechanisms that are coming down the pipeline, and you know, I think one of the really cool things, and if I may just say this to add to it, is that there are a lot of people asking about going to do stem cell clinics in various regions of the world, where it's simply a removal of stem cells from one area of the body and dumping them back into another area of the body and expecting them to know what to do. And we just haven't seen anything significant that's been shown that that has any benefit. And I think one of the cool things about at least the Brainstorm study is that they're trying to augment the ability of these cells to do something, at least when they're there in the area around the degenerating motor neurons. And so I think that that's a key piece a lot of people maybe don't see when they first are told about stem cells. And certainly the piece that you said about the replacement therapy is another key aspect that most people seem to think about at first and not necessarily understand that that's not the general direction that we've been going in the field. Okay, so I mean, as we move forward, is there anything in particular? Okay, actually, I think if there are anyone, since we are recording this, I was wondering perhaps could we take an opportunity, Dr. Matt, for you to summarize anything in French that you think, or en français, that you have heard that maybe hasn't been there, and could you summarize maybe a couple of the key things you've heard on this call that that could be beneficial for those who may not be anglophones?
Oui, donc je pense qu'on a passé beaucoup de temps sur l'Edaravone, qui est, disons, la nouvelle molécule de l'heure, et le fait qu'elle soit potentiellement disponible, ça met ça excite beaucoup les gens, mais il faut réaliser que ça implique beaucoup de temps et d'argent, donc le processus de l'infusion. Il faut réaliser que l'implication des patients, les représentations auprès du gouvernement sont importantes pour, disons, que le molécule soit reçue favorablement, puis ensuite qu'elle soit accessible, qu'elle soit remboursée par les régimes provinciaux. Donc, ça, c'est important. Ensuite, ben, c'est ça. Pour ce qui est de la recherche, c'est quand même important, là, quand on s'y implique, là, de le faire pour le bénéfice de tous, pas seulement le sien. Dans le fond, notre responsabilité, nous, comme chercheurs, c'est de vous offrir des projets de recherche qui sont sécuritaires, encadrés, mais qui nous donnent les réponses qu'on cherche à la fin. Puis enfin, ben, on a discuté là, des molécules qui nous intéressaient pour le futur, comme les cannabinoïdes et leur effet, le masitinib, pour lequel on a déjà pas mal de données animales, des données prometteuses chez l'humain, mais qui doivent être répliquées dans des plus grosses études. Et le système Neuron, qui est une des recherches en cellules souches pour la SLA qui a le plus de presse. Et c'est certain que la façon qu'ils ont trouvé d'injecter les cellules souches est probablement la plus simple, et si l'étude est prometteuse, sera probablement la voie que d'autres suivront par la suite. On entre dans une ère aussi où on n'a jamais eu autant d'essais cliniques offerts aux patients canadiens, probablement suite au bon travail qu'on a fait dans le passé et la présence du réseau canadien des cliniques SLA en recherche. Et probablement que dans le futur, on va avoir une médecine plus de précision où, selon le profil du patient, soit des caractéristiques cliniques ou la génétique, on va atteindre plusieurs cibles à la fois. Ça va être une combinaison de médicaments qui pourrait être la solution au problème. Donc, nous vivons dans une époque intéressante.
Merci. Thank you very much for that. So, okay, in the last, if we were to go to 5:30 with an overtime of half an hour, is there anything in particular that anyone on the phone gets as a frequent question that you know, they think is something that would be really great for us to have as a resource for when that question is happening elsewhere. We would be able to provide them this webinar to listen to. If not, I definitely have questions from listeners that we could go to as well.
Oh, I'd love to hear the listeners.
So I think, you know, one of the questions that we got from a listener, I'm going to just look at one of them, is in terms of, okay, let me see here. List of questions, and I think we've covered a lot of them. Okay, if, no, we've covered that as well. Wow, we've, okay, my apologies. One of the questions that wasn't covered is, does anyone know what the actual regimen is for Edaravone in stroke in Japan, how it is used? I think we've covered the fact that it is the same treatment regimen, but for how long the people are actually on the drug.
Do you remember, Christen? I believe
I think it's just one cycle. I think it's just the treatment.
Yeah, the 14 days while they're in the hospital.
Okay. So actually, I do have another question that, you know, looking at what's on the slide right now, actually, one of the questions I get frequently is around Nuedexta. Now, Nuedexta is a drug that is not meant to be originally approved in the U.S. for disease-modifying or slowing down disease, although it is in trial for that. It is used for the pseudobulbar affect. And there are people who ask, you know, what do I do for wanting to obtain Nuedexta or to treat my pseudobulbar affect in Canada?
Oh, I can answer that one. It's Colleen.
Sure, hi.
I've actually been using this for a couple of years now, since it was approved in the United States. Both the Nuedexta is basically two compounds combined together. The two individual products are available in Canada and are relatively inexpensive. And so I get compounding pharmacies to basically make me Nuedexta. So I just have them compound together the dextromethorphan and the quinidine in the exact same quantities and amounts that is in the Nuedexta tablets. And so until it's available here, that's how I've been treating patients with it.
It's Christen. I'll just add, though, that I think that there has been a supply issue with the quinidine because I have been prescribing it for a couple of years now, but patients have been coming back to me in the last few months saying that the pharmacies can't get the quinidine right now. So I'm not sure if anybody else has had that issue, so I'm not sure if there's a supply issue going on or not.
Have you been getting it compounded from the powder, Christen?
I don't know the answer to that. All I do is I write the prescription and they inform them to take it to a compounding pharmacist, and they put it in a capsule, but I don't know if the original is the powder versus something else.
I've made in liquid formulation for patients, and they can put it in G-tube.
Okay. Yeah, but in terms of what's compounded, we do both pill and liquid. We have not been informed by our compounding pharmacies of a shortage of quinidine. The quinidine pills have been off the market, but the powder's been accessible. So I haven't heard that there's a shortage. I actually started using this combination in the early 2000s because the original principal investigator, Richard Smith, told me anecdotally about it. And because both drugs were available, I started using it in selected patients off-label with pretty good success. So it is available to the extent that the drug's available. The problem is the quinidine has gone out of favor as a heart medicine. And so the ability to get the quinidine might be limiting. I know that there's interest to have that trial testing Nuedexta, address the question of if it actually affects progression of the bulbar symptoms, and that might be something that will prompt them to approach Health Canada to get it approved. In that case, there would be no question that the supply would be there because it's being manufactured. I hope that we can do that because I worry a little bit that the quinidine supply will become problematic, as Christen, your patients have discovered.
Great. Well, I think with that, it is 5:30. I will say that, again, to those listeners who are still there, and it appears there's still a number of listeners, that's fantastic. It's a testament to the how much, you know, everyone appreciates your valuable time, each of the four of you, so thank you so much for being a part of this. You know, I would love to be able to do one of these again at some point. Again, we will do webinars in 2018 where a lot of these will be explained in more detail about the facts of the trials as they are moving forward. And for those who are listening, who are Francophone as well, we are planning to do some French webinars in the new year as well, some science webinars, as well as some potentially some clinical webinars. So please stay tuned for those. Again, Dr. Shoesmith, Dr. O'Connell, Dr. Matt, Dr. Johnston, thank you so much for your time. I know everyone appreciates it. And for those of you out there who have asked questions or continue to ask questions, I will endeavor to follow up with you for those answers. So thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful